All right, hello everyone. Good to be with you again. So in today's lecture, we're going to be digging in to more depth on the conception of sin. I know we've already talked about it extensively when we're looking at Genesis and already laid a lot of the foundational work right there. But here I want to look at it more particularly through the Christian lens, and we'll be using St. Paul to do that. And then on the flip side of sin, we'll be looking at grace as a concept, which is especially going to become important when we move into the thought of St. Augustine. So the way that I want to approach this is to ask and begin to answer a classic philosophical question, which is one of the most difficult questions that we have. Even now it's an active one, is how do we account for the existence of bad action in the world? So for the sake of argument, let's say that that we're going to accept that there is such a thing as bad action, meaning there are actions that people do that are bad. Now remember from earlier lectures, we talked about the possibilities here. We could say, for example, well, I don't believe in bad action. I don't think that it's all just subjective or it's all culturally relativistic. One person's bad as another person's good. Therefore, there's no such thing as objectively bad action. That is a position. You can take a relativistic position. But remember, the implication of that is that all action then is ultimately arbitrary, no matter what it may be in terms of its goodness or its badness, which also means that we can't claim either to ourselves or to other people that any specific conception of what's good, bad, or right and wrong is any better than any other. So there's massive implications there, right? And the questions of how we could even make any determinations against sort of a tyrannical, genocidal ruler and someone, say, like Mother Teresa. From the relativistic perspective, you'd just have to say they made different choices, but those are equally arbitrary choices that they made. So you can take that position, but for the sake of argument, let's say that we can define that there is such a thing as bad action. So the question is, well, how do we give an account for it? So what I want to do is to look at a model of action that recognizes the sort of the action doesn't exist just in and of itself, that it emerges from an internal process as well. And there I'm going to start off with a classical philosophical model that we see, for example, in the thought of Socrates, refracted in and through the philosopher Plato and Aristotle, and then show how the Christian view in and through St. Paul maps onto that, but also changes that. So in order to get us started, let me just draw a generic human being. And here we want to recognize that we have an outside and an inside. This is inside the person, this is outside the person. We'll draw a line here. So we'll have the person looking here. And what we're trying to account for is something called bad action, okay? Now, throughout the lecture, I'll also be talking a little bit about just the condition for the possibility of any action itself, moral action, but eventually we'll be talking about bad action specifically. So the first thing to note is that, in terms of assessing other people, really all we have is looking at their actions, right? We don't really know or don't have direct access to at least the internal processes that are going on. And so we have to use their action. But that doesn't mean that the internal processes, one, are not there, or two, are not important. That's what this model is going to get at. But we also have to keep in mind that there's lots of different ways of detecting what action is as well, right? I'm not just talking about overtly evident action, like somebody hitting somebody gratuitously out of a celebration of violence or something like that. We could say, well, that's bad action, I can see it. But also, more subtle things like, a look or a glance, or someone, with rage in their eyes or hatred in their eyes, or, seeing somebody happy that they detest and just like eating them up on the inside. You can see it in their eyes. So there's different ways of detecting this. But basically, in terms of the moral assessment of action, and we look at other people, we have to look at what's visible. But there's a lot going on the inside that we can get access to by thinking through it carefully. And we're going to look at a classic Socratic model here to do that. So what's going on the inside? Well, in order to break this down, what we're going to look at is sort of an anatomy of action itself. So if you split open an action, and look up on the inside and say, well, what's the condition for the possibility of any action at all for a human being to do something? So the classical Greek model, and again, we see this very pronounced in the thought of Plato and Aristotle, is to say, well, first and foremost, you have to have something along the lines of reason. That in order to act, the human being must be able to identify something for which they are acting, a goal that they want to accomplish. Now, literally speaking, to act without a goal, to act without having any conception of that which you are seeking to accomplish or attain, is to act with madness, is to act arbitrarily. So reason, first and foremost, its role or function in this model is to identify, or perhaps any other model, is to identify a goal that one seeks to accomplish. So we can say that part of reason is about an end or goal, and that reasons has to function in order to identify that eventually is going to result in an action. However, reason also has another function as well. So it's one thing to say, this is the goal that I have in mind, the goal that I'm seeking to accomplish. It's another thing to say, well, what are the means? What are the means that I'm going to use in order to accomplish that goal, right? And the two things, we have to see them as a unity, but also split them up to see that they're different. Now, this is especially important because from when we're looking at this, not only in terms of the psychology or the anatomy behind it, the moral anatomy of it, but the actual sort of the assessment of any particular action, either internally or externally. For the most part, and there's some exceptions to this, but for the most part, in order for an action to be morally good, it must not only have a good goal, but there also must be a good means. So to use an extreme example, but one that's not without precedent in history, I could say, well, my goal, I could, let's just imagine I'm some terrible tyrant, genocidal tyrant, and you'll see why the example points to that. Let's say my goal is to eradicate poverty. My goal is to eradicate hunger. Well, on the surface, that, of course, sounds like a good goal. So I say, well, that's good. So any action that you do to eradicate hunger would be good, right? Not necessarily. What if, as some tyrants have done in history, the way that I do this, say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to exterminate any part of the population that I see as somehow unproductive, the ones who are most likely to fall into poverty, to enter the cycles of hunger. So I'll just eradicate them and then leave just the productive members of society behind. Well, that's horrifically terrible, right? But it's in its extreme example, again, our historical precedent for this example, but it just goes to show it's not enough just to say you have a good goal. You must also have a good means, a good method of achieving that goal in order for the action to ultimately be good. So reason identifies the good goal, the goal that according to your own thinking you think is good and worthy of attaining, and then the means by which you're going to carry out that goal. Well, what this model also shows is, and it has deep insight into this, is that reason itself is not enough in order to act. That reason is a kind of, it's a cognitive power, and it's capable of identifying things and identifying the path toward things. But in terms of actually acting, well, you're going to have to want it as well. You're going to have a motive power, something that moves you towards that goal and the way that you have identified that goal. Now, all things being equal, I should say this as well. Desires fall basically in this model into two categories. And then within those categories, there's lots of differentiation. What are the two categories? We have desires for things, meaning we move out into the world in order to sort of to make things our own in one way or another. So we're attracted to objects, and we're also, and this would include people as well, and we're also repelled, okay? So there's attraction and repelling, and the insight here is that without a desire either of attraction or repelling, reason itself is not enough to move you to do anything. So with reason plus desire, we get something called an intention or a choice. An intention or a choice. Now, why is this important? Well, because morality, again, typically speaking, is located not in the action itself, but in the intention of the action. Meaning what you what you wanted to do, reason plus desire. So to use a simple example, say you're driving down the street and you're driving on Lincoln, and then somebody swerves into your lane. Say a bicyclist all of a sudden loses control and swerves into your lane. And so in order to avoid that bicyclist, you swerve over. So your intention there is what? It's not to cause harm, to avoid causing harm to somebody. But let's say the actual action itself of swerving leads to the consequence of hitting somebody in the next lane, and there's a minor injury there. Well, that's a bad outcome. It's not good that that outcome happened, but it's not a bad action because the intention was right. The reason plus the desire was good. So this is typically where we locate morality. All right. So now the question, let's go back to the fundamental philosophical question. How do we explain bad action? Well, if everything's working here, what should happen, and this is the model that Socrates, again, through Plato develops, or Plato through Socrates develops, is that reason should be kind of like, in the image that they use, is a charioteer, like the one person wagon, Roman or Greek, and the charioteer represents reason. The charioteer is that which controls, sort of guides the chariot, and desire is understood. It's typically portrayed as two horses. Desire is understood as a kind of a motive power, right? It's that which pulls the chariot along. So you need both of them, right? Because if you just have desire, you just have random a power that's wild and can move you in any direction. But if you're just sitting there in your chariot with no horses, you're not going to go anywhere. So all things being equal, the model suggests that we should have reason governing our desires, and then that leads to a good intention, and that leads to good action. But then the question becomes, okay, well then how in the world do we explain bad action, right? If reason is there and reason is capable of identifying what's good and what, again, I'm not even talking about external things telling you what's good. It's like your own reason is saying this is good, then, and it's functioning, right? Then why isn't it always the case that reason leads desire to do what reason thinks is good? Why is there bad things that happen? Why do people, that's passive voice is wrong. Why do people do bad things? Well, one potential answer to that, and it's an answer that Socrates considers at length, is to say, well, you know what the problem is that ignorance overtakes reason or is in the place of ignorance, meaning that people just don't know better. They don't have the right knowledge. And because they don't have the right knowledge, their desires don't know which path to follow. And so they end up following a bad path and therefore result in bad action. Now, this is a very popular conception of bad action, or explanation, I should say, of bad action, even to this day. Most sociological analysis, most of it, comes down to the basic, or based upon, I should say, it's based upon the fundamental insight that people replicate behaviors and patterns of knowledge that they're born into and that they're raised in. So that the reason that people do bad things is because they were born into bad environments and had bad examples, and those patterns are therefore replicated. The basic idea being that people are primarily, if not exclusively, the products of their circumstances. That's a very common sociological anthropology, at least within dominant forms of sociology in the academy today. I'm not saying it's only that, but it's certainly primarily that. And then there's others who want to put that sort of social determinism in connection with genetic determinism, which sort of complexifies and compounds the determinism. But basically the idea here is that, look, if we can somehow deal with the ignorance, then we'll be able to get rid of the bad action. Okay, so let's consider that. Let's say, for example, that what we're going to do to fix ignorance is we're going to give right education. Okay? That some people actually do know what's true and right and good, and then they're going to teach the people who don't know what's true and right and good about what's true and right and good, and they'll recognize it as true and right and good. And once they recognize it as true and right and good, then they will their desires will act according to what they recognize as true and right and good. and we'll get rid of bad action. Okay, now without downplaying the importance of education here, there's a huge philosophical, there's actually several philosophical conundrums with this explanation, either of the origins of bad action or how we would fix it with education. One of them is this: how do we know who has, like, how is it the case that some people have the right truth and some people don't have that access to that truth? So then the point is, we need to connect the people with the truth to the people without the truth. We need to pour the truth into them. We'll push that all the way back. Like, what's the origins of the people who have the truth and the origins of the people who don't have the truth? And how did that break happen in the first place? And why did this group get to have the truth and this group not get to have the truth? Because what we're saying with this model, let's be very clear here, some people know what's good and some people don't know what's good. Some people are ignorant. So the question is if there isn't a kind of universal access to the truth, if we're saying that's not the case, because we're saying that some people are ignorant and some people aren't, so we're saying that some people do know and some people don't know, so there's not universal access to the truth, at least not in a sense of like natural law or somehow inscribed into our natures or our conscience or something like that. Well, then what is the origin of that truth group? And then there's another problem there. When those people are teaching the ignorant people, well, if they're ignorant, how are they going to know what they're being taught is true, right? In fact, even Socrates gets into these complexities. It's like, I know something that you don't know, and so I want to teach you what I don't know. Okay, well, unless you somehow already know it in some sense, then I won't be able to teach you that, right? You won't be able to recognize it as true. It would just sound like gibberish to you. So how do we account for that, right? It's not only the case that some people know and some people don't know. In order to teach them, you must somehow say that they have the capacity for it in some way. If the capacity for it in some way, they already have at least some kind of recognition of the truth, in which case, why do they need to be taught? And seriously, why do they need to be taught? So there's that philosophical wrinkle. Here's another one, and perhaps this is the biggest one. What this model would be presupposing is that the more educated you are, makes me laugh because, you know, we can test this against experience. The more educated you are, the more morally upright you are, meaning the better you act. So higher levels of education, higher levels of morality. We can do sort of a one-to-one correlation there. Does that even pass the smell test in terms of being an accurate description of reality in terms of what we witness in terms of educational level and moral behavior? Now, I'm not just saying, we have to be careful here. We're not just looking at like crimes necessarily, especially, you know, violent crimes or things like that. We're looking at morality in its totality. So certainly you do find people who are very well educated committing horrific crimes. Of course you do. There's lots of that. But here, in terms of, we're looking at good action. We'd say that the best people you're going to find in terms of their moral conduct are by definition going to be the most educated, according to this model here. Do we actually see that? Do we actually see that? If that's the case, well, then how do we account for the numerous examples that we can point to at any given time, either in our own personal life or what we're reading in the news, or our awareness of different of different scandals that are happening in different kinds of places? Like, how do we account for the bad behavior if this is true? Because what this model is saying is that, look, you'll see the light once I teach you the light, and then that enough will mean you'll see, oh my gosh, that is true. And because it's true, I'm going to act that way, right? Does that actually hold up to experience? Let's say, for the sake of argument, it doesn't. That there must be something else going on here with bad action, that we can't get rid of bad action just by having some sort of educational program. And so maybe, for the sake of argument here, maybe it's not ignorance, at least as its primary cause. Maybe ignorance is part of it, but not as primary cause. And if it's not ignorance, therefore education isn't going to solve the problem. This is all going to be important because we're going to be talking about sin here, but then also grace. So grace is going to be in a different category than education. That's where we're headed with all of this. So we're kind of back to square one here. If we're assuming that there is such a thing as bad action, And we can't account for bad action by pointing to ignorance for the reasons that we just identified. Well, what else can we point to? Well, another potential option is to say, well, it's not that people actually do know. People actually do know that, like, we all have some access to good, bad, and right and wrong. But the problem is our desires, they overcome us. Our desires are too strong. And so we end up doing things that we know aren't right because our desire overtakes us. Okay, that's getting us closer to St. Paul. St. Paul's going to be sort of in that area, although making some pretty significant changes to that possibility. But we're getting closer to what he has in mind. But here's the problem with that, for the sake of argument. If it's true that reason is intact and reason knows what's good and knows how to do what's good, but then just gets overtaken by desire, well, one, why can't we just stop that? You know, like why can't reason just say, I ignore you, desire? Why does reason do that? Two, if that's true, that basically means that we're a slave to desire, that we can't overcome our desire. But maybe even more than that, the question is it an accurate description of the nature of desire itself? So here's the thing about desire. Desire is not one thing, right? Desire is to use the model working with, it's sort of like a blind force, but we as human beings have lots of blind forces operating at many different times in the same way. And oftentimes, not only are there manifold ones, meaning there's different ones, but they're actually acting in direct conflict with each other. So to give you a simple example, think of waking up in the morning, getting out of bed in the morning, I should say. So on the one hand, and I'm probably not being presumptuous here, on the one hand, you probably have one desire that's very strongly pushing you back into that bed, into the pillow, and another desire, and maybe it's even a much weaker desire, but it's still there, if assuming not in a severe depression, which certainly can happen. But another desire that's saying, no, get out of bed and on with your day. So there you have two desires. You have two desires, and they're in direct conflict with each other. So to say that that desire just sort of, we just act on our desires, it's always a question. Well, you know, which desire are we acting on? Especially if reason has kind of been made inert and inactive, been taken out of the ring. In fact, at this time, you probably have 5, 10, 15, 20 different desires going on at the same time, right? Especially if you're watching a video. This is the generation of multitasking, right? Maybe you're on your phone, maybe you want to get up and leave, maybe there's a part of you that wants to go to sleep, maybe there's a part of you that wants to stay and listen, maybe there's a part of you that's worried about the upcoming assignment or whatever. So there's all these different desires that are pushing you in different directions, and then it's a question of, well, which one then takes priority if reason's not evolved? Because if reason's not powerful enough to control our desires, then any potential desire could be the one that pops out, which would get us beyond people doing bad action. That would look like a form of insanity, right? If at any given time, any one of our desires could be the one that pops out as the one that we act on, because we're saying reason has lost control, it's been overcome by our desires, then it's a question of, how do we even have a personality? Like, how would we be identifiable as one being, as a person, as an individual that has certain kind of contours and coherence to them, if it's just at any given time, any desire is popping out of us and that's what we're doing? So for the sake of argument, desires themselves doesn't appear to be a sufficient explanation for explaining why people do bad things, given the multiplicity of desires and given the ways in which they conflict with each other. So what St. Paul is going to add to this, and this is, there's roots of this in the Old Testament, but it really comes to a head in the thought of St. Paul and in the New Testament, but particularly in St. Paul in the New Testament, is that this model is missing something. So St. Paul is going to adopt this model, but say that it needs one more piece to make it make full sense in and of itself, and then in order to understand sin. So what St. Paul is going to add to this model is the idea of there being a will, and that the will is something related to reason but different from reason, and related to desires but different from desires. and that the will, at least when it's functioning properly, should be understood as kind of one thing. It's like a bridge between reason, which is capable of identifying what's good, but basically inert, and desires, which are all over the place and just sheer raw power. Will is that which sort of takes the communication of what's good from reason and then imposes it on the desires so that an intention can be made and an action can be performed. Again, we're going to get back to bad action in just a second. So to use an analogy in order to illustrate this, we could say it's the first time that you went to Loyola Marymount University, and you didn't know exactly. You kind of knew where it was, but you didn't know exactly how to get there. You'd never driven there before, so you get your phone and you say, "Navigate to Loyola Marymount University." Well, what happens? It shows you where it is on the map that appears on your screen, and it shows you how to get there, or the potentially different routes to get there, right? Well, so reason then is like a map. It identifies where we want to go, or sorry, where we should go, where we've identified it's good to go, and then how to get there, the different potential paths on how to get there, and then reason which is the best path. But if you just have a map, you're going to just stand there, right? You need a motive power. You need something to move you to your destination. Well, that's the sort of the rules of desires. Desire, again, sheer raw power. So desire is like the motor. I'm going to use a car analogy. It's like the motor. Now, a motor in and of itself just generates power, right? It moves, and it moves you, but it potentially moves you in any direction. So in order to connect the map, which by itself is totally powerless, to our desires, which is just sheer power but totally blind, we need something that's not blind but also has power, and that's the will. So the will in this analogy is like a steering wheel. All of this would be the driver. The will takes what is identified as good and the means to achieve that good, and then directs the sheer raw power of the desire to its intended destination. Right? So we need this intermediary figure, something that's not really present in the thought of Aristotle and in Socrates and Plato. It's sort of there in a very inchoate form, but here we see it really emerge in the thought of St. Paul. It's the will. The will really is going to be like the heart of action. It's not a substitute for reason or desire, but you can't really explain action, certainly moral action, without it. Now, this is going to tip us back into the idea of bad action. Where the will can be really most present in one way is when we're experiencing temptation. So think of what temptation is. Think of that experience when you've genuinely been tempted. What is that like, right? Now, again, we're talking about you feeling temptation, you experiencing temptation, not just reading about it. So what does it look like from the inside? Well, in order for temptation to be there, what our minds must be identifying something. Say our minds are telling you, don't do that. Your own reason is saying, don't. It's bad, right? Don't go there. Don't do that. Don't engage in that. Don't, whatever. We can put anything there, but don't do it, right? Your own reason is telling you that. But yet you have desires that are saying, do it, do it. Come on. Yes, you want to. It's a very strange thing, right? Because, again, we're not saying it's somebody from the outside is telling you don't do it. We could perhaps build that into the system as well, but we don't need to at this point. It's you yourself are telling yourself don't do it, and you yourself are telling yourself do it. And so now what this has generated is a kind of tension, right? So if you're just acting according, the question is well, how do you resolve that tension? Because there's really two options here. Either you're going to do it or you're not going to do it. It's either A or B. Either you're going to give in to your temptation or you're not going to give in to your temptation. So how do you not give in to your temptation? Well, you don't give in to your temptation because there's this other power within you that we'll identify as the will. And it's in popular anthropology understood as what? Willpower. That through willpower, you can actually overcome what part of you wants but shouldn't want. So through willpower, let's say you are able to overcome the desires that are pushing you in a particular kind of direction, and to follow, therefore, what your reason identifies as good. So in temptation, all of a sudden you realize I have to make a choice, and I am neither my reason nor am I my desires. The choice-making part of me is sort of pulled by these two powers on either end, and I have to choose which one I'm going to identify as me and the decision that I'm going to make. Well, there pops out the will. But things get a little, so it's, for the sake of argument, say it's there. There is something like the will in us. But then how do we give an account of bad action? Like, why would people do bad things, even accounting for the presence of the will? Well, something else we have to get on the table is well, let's assume that we do have desires that push us in the bad direction. Why do we have desires that push us in a bad direction? Why do we have desires that push us in a direction that our own brain says is bad, right? Think of sort of a more simplistic animal and try and map on human psychology to those more basic animals or even advanced animals. Do you see advanced animals having a sort of existential crisis where their natural impulses are pulling them in one direction, but their minds are telling them to go in another direction? One of the gifts, maybe I could use that term, of being an animal is they don't appear to be split, right? Their calculations about what to do at any given particular moment, whether it's to avoid predators or to get food or to communicate something socially with the other animals around them, they're in line with their desires. So it's only something that appears to be something unique to humans to have this split between what our minds are telling us and what our different powers in our body are telling us. So that's already pointing to a kind of split. But in order to get that a little deeper, I want to read something from St. Paul. So this is from, whether or not this was in your assigned reading or not in your assigned reading, this gets at the heart of the Christian conception, not only of will, but how sin then is related to will. And so it applies whether we're thinking primarily about ethics and good and bad, right and wrong, or politics. And I'll unspin all that at the very end of the lecture. So this is St. Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 7, and I'm starting at 15, verse 15. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law, meaning that which I identify as true and good and right, is good. But in fact, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good lives within me, that is in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. That goes up to verse 20. All right, so we could spend like a semester unpacking everything that's going on there. But let me just try and break it down to its most fundamental expression. What St. Paul is identifying here is that there is something about human beings, and here he's universalizing this. He thinks this is part of the human condition, in which we're capable, one, of not doing what we do want. So I identify it as good, and I want to do it, but I don't do it. So how do I not do something that I do want to do? And I also am capable of doing something that I hate, doing something that I know is bad, and part of me doesn't want to do, but does do. And he's being very clear here. He's not talking about somebody forcing you to do this. It's not like someone has a gun to your head and saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you. This is all internal. This is all inside each one of us, according to St. Paul. So what he's pointing to is that the problem of sin is, first and foremost, it's not primarily, it includes this, but it's not primarily a problem of reason. It's not the case that we really don't know what's good and bad and right and wrong. And it's not even primarily the case of desire, because we have desires that are in the good direction. We have desires in a bad direction, but good direction too. So for him, it's not reason, and it's not that raw motive power of desire. The problem of sin is going to be somewhere here. And the problem is that the will, which should be unitary, the will should always be that one unifying power that pulls all of our desires together and moves them in one direction towards what's genuinely good. Well, that unfortunately, it's unfortunate in the sense that we create it. It's not a natural part of nature. It's split in two. And that part of us wills for what is good and part of us wills for what is bad. And that renders us profoundly broken on the inside. We become incapable of doing what we want, and we do that which we do not want at the same time. This, for him, is the problem of sin. It's not a cognitive issue primarily. You can't teach yourself out of it. He already knows what's going on. He knows that he knows what's good. He knows the law. He knows how he should be acting. He knows what he should want. But he can't do it because he's at war with himself. That's the problem of sin, you see, is that in the Christian tradition, it's a self-imposed tearing open of what should be the unifying force to each individual. It's a tearing it open and a splitting it against itself. And one of the popular culture ways that this used to be portrayed was you have an angel on one side and a devil on the other, right? Now we'll complexify that in a later lecture, but it's that we're at odds with ourselves. We're at war with ourselves. And it's not just the case that we're at war with ourselves, that interior brokenness, where we do things that we don't want to do, knowing that we don't want to do them and we shouldn't do them and yet still doing them, that interior brokenness spills over into the world. And so because I'm broken, I sort of replicate that brokenness in my social relationships because I kind of hate myself in a way, like I can't be with myself. Then that gets sort of replicated out into other people, and that misery sort of loves company, right? So misery sort of spreads, and that I engage in destructive relationships with other people, and that those relationships, each individually destructive on its own, sort of creates these social systems and sort of cultures and institutions that ultimately sort of crystallize this kind of destructiveness and then replicate it. So you can see how this individual brokenness gets put out into the world and sort of set up, which then exacerbates the individual brokenness. So this is a dire problem. And this is why for St. Paul and for the Christian tradition more generally, is that sin is such one, on the one hand, so destructive because it emerges from this internal war, and at the same time, so hard to extinguish. It's not, again, it's not an issue of education. So you can't extinguish this problem just by telling people what they should do, because they already know it for the most part, right? They already know it. It's a different beast than just a cognitive one. So this then leads to this idea of grace. The basic idea of grace, and we're going to develop this a lot when we get into the thought of St. Augustine, but the basic idea of grace is that the problem of sin is such that we can't fix ourselves. Since I'm the source of my own problem, I'm also incapable of fixing it myself. It's like, think of if you get a bacterial infection, and it's because something has gone off balance, off kilter in your body. And the infection gets so big, so great, that you actually can't fight it with your own antibodies. It's going to kill you unless you get what? An infusion from the outside, antibiotics, okay? So it's a weak analogy, but it still works, right? You need help from the outside. You can't do it yourself. And we can even say that the problem generated from the inside, for some breakdown of a system that wasn't working as it should be working. Well, that's what this idea of grace is that the only way to fix this problem, according to St. Paul, is if from the outside, both working internally and coming from the outside and working externally as well, that what grace does is it provides sort of a healing unity And Christians will understand this as specifically as Christ working in and through a human being who enters into relationship with Christ. That what that does is it's that external power, and it's the only thing possible of healing this rift, that we can't heal it ourselves. Well, think about this. Whether you identify as religious or not, or Christian or not, think about that. If it is truly the case that people can heal themselves, period, like without any kind of external gift or intervention, however specifically you want to define that, then why are people miserable? Why is anybody ever unhappy? Think about it. If we have the power of self-healing, one, why don't we heal ourselves like instantly? Or two, let's say it maybe takes some work, but why don't we just do the work and eventually heal ourselves? But why would it take work? If I'm the source of the problem and I'm also the source of the solution, well, why don't I just choose to be the solution right now and be done with it? Unless maybe, do I have an attraction to my own destruction? Well, if that's the case, then we're back into this territory here. So whether or not you think you identify with this theological paradigm or not, it's a serious question, right? If you take it for granted that there are people who are miserable, and if they're not miserable, they're unhappy. And even if they're not unhappy, there's still a kind of latent or potential anxiety in them that could well up and spring out at any moment. If that's true about human beings, and we are capable of fixing that ourselves, then why don't we just do it? And why would we say, well, there's a secret path, and there's this, like, you have to have a special knowledge, you have to read this book, or you have to join this club. And it's like, why? If I made the problem, then I should be able to fix it if I can fix it, right? Well, what this model is suggesting is, you know what? You can't. You can't fix it because you broke yourself to the degree that only by outside intervention will you have any hope of sort of regaining that interior wholeness and sanity. And that must be understood as coming from the outside. It also has to be understood as gift, right? Because here in this model, if I truly am the source of my own destruction, at least to some degree, and this is not discounting that a lot of pain and suffering people have is because of what other people do to them. But if at some level I'm the source of my own destruction, then it would be like me saying that somebody has to come fix me, be like, I'm going to destroy myself and it's your job to come fix me. I'm entitled for you to come fix me. Even though it's I am the one who's responsible for this situation. Well, maybe that person does want to come and help, right? But to express the obligation in the form of you must do this, or like you're contractually obligated to do this, misapprehends the nature of the problem, right? It's difficult even from a conception of justice to say, I've caused harm and it's your responsibility to fix it. You must do it. It's going to misread both the anthropological level and the theological level. So grace is understood as a gift, as something that God wants to do, but doesn't have to do precisely because of the nature of the problem. But what we're going to see is, as we develop these ideas further, is that without grace, all we're eventually going to get is bad action. And the explanation for bad action is because people want to do bad things. Like, that's the explanation. Why people do bad things is because they want to do them. Sometimes they want to even do them precisely because they're bad. Like, to hell with it. I'm just going to go harm. I'm going to harm myself and I'm going to harm others in different ways. Now, that's a much tougher nut to crack in terms of fixing it. The only way, as we move through this paradigm in greater depth, will be being healing from the outside. And when we look at Augustine, we're going to be looking at that particularly through the lens of using like addiction and the possibility of breaking that addiction as somehow requiring some sort of greater power. We'll use that as a metaphor. Now, to conclude here, what are the implications for this? There's ethical implications, there's moral implications. Let me talk about there's ethical implications, there's political implications. Let me address the ethical implications briefly. What this model is going to suggest is that on the one hand, we can define some sort of moral perfectionism. So with St. Paul and with all Christians in one way or another, it's not the case that we can't know what the good is, either through a combination of natural law and scripture, or whether just scripture. we can know what goodness is. We can know what good action is. We can know what it is to be good. We're going to complete this next time and talk about how this relates to the conception of virtue. So again, it's not a problem of knowledge, but at the same time, we also recognize that none of us can achieve that good, according to this model, by our own efforts. So on the one hand, we have the definition. On the other hand, we recognize that all human beings, because of who we are, necessarily fall short of that definition because we embrace sin, and therefore the only way to bridge that gap is to rely upon God and God's grace, and specifically the theological tradition of Christians, a relationship with the Christ. So that really influences how we conceive of not only the definition of the good, but the way in which human beings can and cannot make moral progress without a relationship with the divine. So that has massive ethical implications we'll be unpacking as we move through additional lectures. Political implications. Well, if that's true at the moral level, and this is true at the anthropological level, and this is true at the theological level, what this means is that no government, no state, no system of authority can ever, that's purely human in nature, which anything that human beings make is going to be human in nature. No system of power that human beings create can make perfect humans. The problem of sin, in other words, is not something that can be fixed by a government. It can't be fixed by an ideology. It can't be fixed by a charismatic leader. What that does is that imposes, this theological substructure imposes limits on the aspirations of any kind of particular order. Because no matter what it is specifically, it must be understood from a Christian perspective as not being God, ontologically speaking, but in terms of fixing this problem in all human beings as not being the means by which human beings can be brought to their fullness, right? So any state that does claim that they are the solution to the problem of bad action, from a Christian perspective, is wrong in terms of it's not corresponding with reality, but also dangerous because it's seeking to impose a fix on something that's actually part of the problem. It's like the person who just poisoned you is now going to say, I'm going to be your doctor as well. Like that, it's just going to replicate the problem even more. So to give a concrete example of what kind of system this theological model rules out, North Korea today. Any form of despotic, totalitarian, atheistic system, atheistic understood as the government itself must be understood as the highest good, because there is no good, there's nothing transcendent, so that which human beings create must be understood as the highest good, in some form or another, is ruled out. And again, these are ideas that have existed, do exist, and are made concrete in particular places. Parts of the Chinese Communist political ideology, they make the exact same claim, that this is the highest good, that the fix to whatever problems there are at the human level, the state will fix them through proper education and, if necessary, coercion. Those kinds of things are limited from a Christian perspective. Now, there's still great diversity of potential political or systems, and given the different strands of Christianity that exist. So I'm not saying that it's like clearly the case that that's one obvious answer to what a Christian understanding of politics is. It's not the case, but there are some things that are set as off limits. And one of them, because of the nature of sin and because of the need of grace, which comes outside from God in and through the church in different definitions of church, but from God through church, through Scripture, the state can't do that for you. So to conclude all this, what this means is that, again, these abstract ideas we have about the nature of God, the nature of reality, the nature of human beings, the nature of good and bad and right and wrong, the anthropological level, how we give an account for how people do what they do. These questions that we might just sort of like put up on a shelf and be like, well, that's interesting. You take it down and look at it once in a while, like an art book. Like, interesting. Wow. That's really... Put it back and forget it's there. Like, no, those questions are swirling around us all the time. And not only can we not answer them, we have to answer them, but how we choose to answer them has profound implications for every aspect of our life, both individually and communally. So continue to think through, relate this back to the circles that we worked through in earlier lectures, right? How all these different layers interact. Continue to think through this. And in the next lecture, what we're going to do is to unpack well, there's going to be two more. One, we're going to look at how Christianity can be understood in relationship to the world more generally. And then we're going to take that into St. Augustine, and we'll be unpacking these ideas. But as we're doing it, as you're thinking about your own understanding of all these questions, again, try and make sure all the different pieces fit together and are actually coherent, right? That if you're claiming something here and claiming something here, that you have a clear path from how you get to A and B at all these different levels, and take these theological questions seriously. Because again, we can't not answer them. So what matters is not whether we answer them or not, because we have to answer them either explicitly or implicitly, but how do you answer them? So to be continued. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you again soon.